Welcome to our continuing series of virtual voices. I would like to thank you for your letters and comments. We very much appreciate them. Please continue sending them. Our speaker today is Mr. John Rohe, who is an attorney and the Vice-President of the Colcom Foundation in Pittsburgh. Our moderator is Apurv Gupta, who is on our executive board. Apurv?
Thank you so much, Dr. Durbach and John. It's an absolute pleasure having you join World Information Transfer Virtual Voices series. Everyone, as Dr. Durbach said, John is here to talk about remembering the first Earth Day that took place in 1970. 50 years later, we're going to look back at some of the key tenets that came out of that World Earth Day and see, are we on progress? And if not, what do we have to do? John, with that, I hand over the presentation to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Apurv. How far into the future do young activists focus? As we grow up, we learn to look further and further ahead. A young child can only think of where the next meal might originate. And as we grow up, our future becomes deeper and deeper. So the activists that want to do the right thing, how far do they look when they're still young activists? Well, the answer to that, in 1970, was the activists set a very high bar on the long term. In 1970, the first Earth Day that was inaugurated basically by Senator Gaylord Nelson, US Senator from Wisconsin. He's the founder. And it became the largest demonstration in the history of the United States. This was the newspaper coverage at the time. 20 million demonstrators appeared for Earth Day 1970 as reported by Walter Cronkite. Here's kind of what the street looked like. I'm not sure if you can see that very well. These streets were filled across the United States. But Earth Day 1970 didn't just happen. It followed the 1960s. And the 1960s presented an interesting era. The young people at that time were largely baby boomers, like myself, a boomer. The 60s were filled with colorful, bright images, psychedelic images. We wore bell bottoms. And people like this were showing up on the street to communicate a message. And by the way, this is what 50 years feels like, all right? The glasses are still the same, but not much else, by the way. It's all changed over 50 years, but this gives you a perspective of what 50 years is like. And that's what we're talking about here. We're talking about 50 years when this guy, you know, he didn't realize at the time that he was looking way, way down in the future. He was just following a trend, following the 60s, where Paul Ehrlich had written The Population Bomb in 1968 that brought population to the forefront. Basically, it was a simple concept, mathematically simple. If you say double your numbers in a single generation, if mom and dad have 4 children on average, then the population goes from 2 to 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, 128, 256, 512, 1,000, and it's through the roof. So at some point you have to kind of flatten that curve or you're just going to create problems. So we went on Johnny Carson. Johnny Carson was the late night comedian, and Paul Ehrlich, the author of The Population Bomb, appeared there. Now, population wasn't the only thing that we were talking about in the 60s. Of course, it was a time of gender equity. It was a time of the sexual revolution. We were trying to figure out things like, why are our friends being sent to Vietnam and coming back in body bags? We still don't have a very good answer to that. We were it was a time of some nice parties. We had some great music, by the way. 60s, remember, we imprint on that music. And so when Earth Day 1970 came about, it was like kind of a crowning gem to the 60s. The era was one of question authority. How do we make sense of the world? How do we make sense of our role in the world? How do we make sense of things around us? Let's try to be logical. Let's try to make sense of things. And so these curves like this, that seared a mark on our collective conscience. Paul Ehrlich, in his words, pardon me as I read this, whatever problem you're interested in, you're not going to solve it unless you also solve the population problem. Pick your problem. What is it? Education, healthcare, food, hardship, biodiversity losses, plastics in the ocean, greenhouse gas emissions. Pick your problem. There was an ethic to this. We didn't necessarily even know that at the time. That guy you saw just a minute ago with the same glasses, maybe he was drawn to the ethics, but the long-term ethics of this might have been a little bit elusive at that time, because the nature of this is so far in the future, and with a 50-year retrospective, we're going to talk about that just a little bit here. Part of that ethic was written by a bioethicist known as Garrett Hardin. In 1967 or 68, he wrote The Tragedy of the Commons. And it's a wonderful piece. At the time, it was probably the most popular essay written at that time. And basically, Professor Hardin from the University of California, Santa Barbara, said that we have to think about the externalities. There's a population component, but we also need to think about the externalities. What are the costs of the economic progress that we're making? How do we account for those costs? And are we still on, Apurv? It looked like there was something happening to the screen. We're still good. Okay. So
We're fine.
Yeah, Professor Hardin enabled us to nurture an ethic, understanding our role in this fragile yet resilient ecosystem. How do we responsibly anticipate future conditions? And again, the piece was A Tragedy of the Commons. It's probably still worth reading. So through all of this, Senator Gaylord Nelson had the idea that we should start Earth Day, but it didn't start just with Earth Day. I interviewed Gaylord Nelson early in the 21st century here, I think it was 2003 for a magazine. And he said in that interview, so back in 1962, said Gaylord Nelson, I got the idea that if President Kennedy could be persuaded to do a national conservation tour. This wasn't called Earth Day. This was called a conservation tour. A conservation tour. We would force the issue onto the national political agenda where it had to be. He invited several other senators to go along. And then he said, on the day he selected to begin the tour, the Senate had scheduled a vote on the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. So the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty basically sucked all the oxygen out of the air in the media. And what started as a insignificant little conservation tour by President Kennedy and Senator Gaylord Nelson and others, it went from like the omega to the alpha of popularity. It started with something that didn't really get much attention and culminated in 1970 with the biggest demonstration in the history of the country, 20 million people. Senator Nelson observed, in his words, when I asked him, was it true for both Republicans and Democrats at the time? And he said it was totally bipartisan. Earth Day was totally bipartisan. And when you think of it, 1970, not long after that, did we get the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the National Environmental Protection Act, the Endangered Species Act. These pieces of legislation signed by a Republican president, Nixon at the time, were bipartisan, and Earth Day was bipartisan. Here's a few words from Senator Gaylord Nelson, where he elevated population at that time. Of course, it was already in our vernacular, but he elevated it at that time through Earth Day. It was a focus of Earth Day. When we were around passing out pamphlets and on the streets, population was something that we talked about. It was a central focus of many of us. Shouldn't there be at least a national dialogue on the issue of continued population growth and what it means for the future? Isn't this a question of, quote, the public's right to know? That's Gaylord Nelson. He also said, I'll give you a few quotes just to emphasize the importance, the prominence of the population issue in the mind of the founder of the first Earth Day. Population is the greatest threat to the environment. Here's another line. There is no way in the world we can forge a sustainable society without stabilizing the population. So, where are we on population? A statistic that that really isn't talked about a whole lot these days, certainly not on the 50th anniversary of Earth Day, are, well, how's this population still growing? If so, how much? How much is the global population growing? So there are charts out there like this one that are prepared by the Population Reference Bureau. To my knowledge, this is the oldest demographic organization in the world, PRB, Population Reference Bureau. And if you go to the beginning, certainly you are not going to be able to read these numbers. But if you look at the total population of the world, 7.8 billion right now, and you multiply by the population growth rate and divide by the number of days in a year, you come out to a number that approximately totals 250,000 people a day, give or take. Ballpark, 250,000 people, net gain, births minus deaths every day. Let's think about that for a minute. 250,000 people every day. Every 4 days, we have another 1 million people who will be hopefully finding a sufficient amount of resources to have a quality of life that is dignified, that provides medical care, food, clothing, shelter, education, a place for love, a place to appreciate nature, a place to go for a walk with a dog. So this 250,000 daily net gain does not occur everywhere in the globe. It really, there's parts of the world, number of nations that are what we call sub-replacement level fertility, meaning the number of children that a woman has on average is below 2.1. 2.1 is a very important benchmark for demographers because it means that at that point, mom and dad are filling their shoes from one generation to the next. Again, a number of nations are below 2.1, a number are above 2.1. Some are very much above 2.1. You would probably know that the bulk of the population growth is in places like Africa, Asia, India. Although fertility rates are coming down around the globe, we're still at 250,000 daily net gain. And by the way, let's just look at how we got there. Here's what happened. In 1960, I'll pick 1960 because it was in the 60s that we were talking about. There were 3 billion people. Now we have 7.8 billion people. In 1960, the population around the globe was growing at about 2.1% per year. Okay, now we've brought fertility rates down a great deal. It's no longer growing at 2.1 through a lot of advocacy, a lot of awareness, and a lot of gender equity. You know, where women are treated with dignity, where we treat people with dignity and respect, fertility rates come down. That's really what it takes. So instead of growing at 2.1, we're now growing at something closer to 1.2. This is an approximation. I just do that because 2.1, it's the inverse of 1.2. So it's gone down to 1.2, but we have 7.8 billion people, okay? So if you do the math, 2.1% of 3 billion is actually less than 1.2% of 7.8 billion. And so for all, it was just a good thing that people like Paul Ehrlich and Senator Gaylord Nelson took this seriously a half century ago. If they would have waited more, the situation would have been worse than it is today. So when we look at population dynamics, we look at it in two ways. There's a global dynamic and there's a nation by nation dynamic. And by the way, you can find nation by nation dynamics in charts like this from the Population Reference Bureau. And there are a number of organizations that provide information. It deviates a little bit from one organization to the next, but mostly these demographic organizations are within a percentage or so of each other. In the United States, for example, it is estimated that in 40 years, our 330 million people will increase by 81 million people. I reside in Pittsburgh. In 40 years, 4 decades, we will add 270 Pittsburghs to the United States. This is a pretty big city. We generate a lot of greenhouse gases and waste, and so we're going to add another 270. Is that okay? And this also bears on opportunistic viruses. First, let's talk about a dynamic involving a big issue on Earth Day. Earth Day this year. It happened about a month and a half ago. It was all about greenhouse gas emissions. It's a very important topic, greenhouse gas emissions. And we've made a lot of progress, by the way, with solar, wind, renewable energy. Meanwhile, as the fossil fuel charts would indicate, our consumption of fossil fuel continues to go up. Now, why would that be? With all of the advocacy on greenhouse gas emissions, all of the efforts in Earth Days recently where we talked about this, why would our dependency on fossil fuel keep going up when we have been making progress? And the answer is that basically the gains are being erased by the 250,000 people that we're adding every day. Now, isn't it interesting that on the 50th anniversary of Earth Day, a half a century later, when there were 3.7 billion people on the planet on Earth Day 1970, now we've more than doubled in 50 years. We are at 7.8 billion people on the planet, more than doubled since we started talking about this. Some of the consequences are refugees. The United Nations High Commissioner on Refugees points out that there are now 70.8 million forcibly displaced people on the face of the earth. Think of that for a minute, forcibly displaced people. There are population pressures, there's competition over resources, there's hardship, there's civil uprisings, there's wars. They could be displaced for any number of reasons, including environmental refugees, 70.8 million. What is our ethical responsibility to that? And isn't this interesting? Isn't this fascinating? That on the 50th anniversary, where we commemorate people having the foresight to talk about population issues and bring that into our conscience, on the 50th anniversary, we are in the grip of a global pandemic where we're wearing masks. This is I just carried everything. This is to memorialize this point in history, a global pandemic. And this was discussed on Earth Day 1970. We talked about the prospect of a global pandemic back at that time. In the interval, science was ahead of the virus. The virus could mutate here and there, and science stayed ahead of that race. It always had the edge, year after year, decade after decade. It was batting 1,000. It kept winning the race until it didn't. And here we are. In the interval, it would have been science fiction to try to talk about the relationship between population pressures and pandemics. No one would have listened. Curiously, on the 50th anniversary of when population was all the rage, we still didn't talk about it. And we were being fed news stories like this one. The Southwest megadrought emerges due to global warming in the Washington Post. The Western US is locked in the grips of the first human-caused megadrought. And then relevant to the global pandemic, this is on CNN World. Social distancing is a privilege of the middle class. For India's slum dwellers, it will be impossible. Population pressures have rendered it impossible to dodge the opportunistic virus that can exploit population density, global transit. Here's another one from New York. This is from the New York Times during the pandemic that we just had and that we're still in now. Density is New York's biggest enemy in the coronavirus fight. New York is more crowded than any large city in the country. That helps explain why it is the US epicenter of the outbreak, population density. And on the 50th anniversary of Earth Day, this was not discussed, even though our numbers doubled. When we look at the imperatives that drove people like Senator Gaylord Nelson, who passed away a few years ago, by the way, when we look at the incentives that drove him to bring this to the forefront, what were they? What caused that? Let's think of kindness. Kindness can be exercised in favor of people that are in our presence. If someone has a shortage of food, kindness would cause us to help them. That requires the pound of cure. As Benjamin Franklin addressed it, he called it the pound of cure and the ounce of prevention. A pound of cure is worth an ounce of prevention. And so when we think long-term, we can actually avert a problem by investing that ounce of prevention. But who does that? Who thinks long-term? Who's really focused on that? Because to do that means that you're not going to get people to pat you on the back. No one came up to Senator Gaylord Nelson and said, you know, 50 years from now, this is actually a lot better. It just doesn't happen. We are all the beneficiary of people decades ago, hundreds of years ago, that always sought to make it better for the future. We are their beneficiaries. And yet we don't thank them. We wouldn't even know who to thank. Senator Gaylord Nelson isn't with us anymore, nor are his peers at that time. We can't thank them. All we can do is honor their thoughtfulness, their compassion, their concern, their willingness to exercise kindness, without getting a pat on the back, without saying, hey, thanks for the soup bowl kitchen. They don't get that pat on the back. They're anticipating a future and trying to apply that ounce of prevention. They didn't get a thanks then, but we can still thank them now. How do we thank them? We thank them by honoring their legacy, by thanking them for initiating these conversations 50 years ago. We still have time to do that. We can still do this. We can, and ultimately, all we have to do, it looks like, to bring fertility rates down, it isn't that complicated. We just have to treat people with respect. It's not a matter of becoming, there are poor countries in the world where women are treated respectfully and their fertility rates are below replacement level fertility, below the 2.1 replacement level fertility. There are wealthy countries in the world that have high fertility. Where I was a Peace Corps volunteer, the imperative for high fertility happened to be a religious imperative. Sometimes it's social, sometimes it's cultural. It often has something to do with testosterone, which we might find to be one of the more dangerous chemicals on the face of the earth. But ultimately, we have to treat people with respect, and an emphasis on women. Where women are treated respectfully, fertility rates come down. That's all it takes. But we need to start this conversation. We can't ignore this, and particularly not on the 50th anniversary, where population is reversing all of the technological gains we've made on greenhouse gas emissions. It's rendered us vulnerable to an opportunistic virus where we're all wearing masks, social distancing, it affects our lives everywhere, and we don't even talk about this. Let this conversation begin. My half hour is just about up. I understand I'll have some questions that might be forthcoming. And again, thank you very much for entertaining this conversation.
Well, John, all I want to say is thank you very much for stimulating our conscience and hopefully unconscious about our fragile ecosystem and the issue of population. That was just brilliant. I'm so glad that I had an opportunity to meet you, talk to you, and invite you.
Thank you, Christine. It's a pleasure to be here with you. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, John. That was truly quite contemplative and required. 50 years now, we have to take stock, we have to take progress. I guess what I want to sort of, get your perspectives on really is, I feel from my perspective, where things have really gone wrong is the way we've designed the entire economy and the system. We've designed it in a way that relies on overconsumption and overproduction. And the more we produce, the more people consume, and the cycle goes on, and we can keep the entire edifice from collapsing. And so from that worldview, it makes sense to have a world which is full of people who, are constantly actively participating in the economy, are constantly consuming so that producers can produce. If people are, not as wealthy to actively participate in the economy, we give them credit lines so that they can actively participate in the economy. So what are the sort of solutions can we tackle population by just looking at population, or do we have to look at something much more broader, something more systemic that is allowing for these kinds of trends to continue? And if so, how can we curb it?
That's a wonderful, wonderful question. Apurv, you bring in a wonderful mix of issues. So in short, if we try to think in terms of metaphors, your question frames the issue as the size of our footprint and the number of feet. In other words, when we talk about the economy and the need for the economy to nurture growth, it's built on growth. And if you didn't grow the entire economic system, the bankers, the financiers, everybody, oh, what, you didn't grow? That must mean death or something. You didn't grow, well, then you're dying, basically, right? So that all bears on the size of our footprint. And of course, we have an advertising industry out there that more or less corrupts us into thinking that we need to have a big foot. All of your clothing, your possessions are functionally or aesthetically obsolete, so that we can get you to buy more stuff. We breed this sense of discontentment, letting you think you're going to be happy. But first we got to breed this sense of discontentment. And then we get you to feel happy about buying something that soon thereafter we get you to feel bad about so you can buy more stuff. And it's this cycle. So that deals with the size of the footprint. It's an economic system. Thank you for raising it. We can't forget about that. That's a very important part of this. But at the same time, we also have to have a conversation about the number of feet. In other words, on Earth Day, on Earth Day 2020, there was a lot of talk about how do we make our footprint smaller? How do we avoid spewing out as many greenhouse gas emissions? How do we bring that curve down? How do we make our footprint softer? And that's a valuable conversation. But if we're going to erase all of our gains by adding more feet, we're basically stuck at the same point of unsustainability. So on your question, how do we deal with the economic forces that cause us to want to continue to build more and more and more and more? It's complicated. There are a number of moving parts in that equation. And ultimately, I have a sense that we might find a more contented lifestyle awaits us when we realize that our existing possessions are often functionally, aesthetically okay. And we can get by with what we have. And then we focus more on the criteria of civility, gratitude, and friendships, and meaningful relationships rather than stuff. And meanwhile, we should think about the population issue too.
That's excellent.
That is absolutely correct. I always talk about the fact that one of our biggest problems are alcoholics and shopaholics. And if we could contain those two, or at least learn how to reduce their stress, we might have a more equitable and, how should I say, a more safer world and better environment. Yeah, that's a, and once we make that transition, we could get to a point where we respect each other more as well. The stresses among people often result over the competition for resources. If we look at the basis for every war that was fought over the course of history, somebody wanted something that someone else had. It's a resource war. That's what caused it. It's pretty basic. And often today, we probably have about as much as we need to be happy. The rest of the equation is convincing ourselves that we have the basis of enough to be happy. And we can probably do that and soften our footprint and live a much nicer lifestyle and respect nature. Find some places that we have biodiversity that we can appreciate and enjoy.
That's very well put, John. So thank you for that. John, I'm pretty sure you must have seen it. A lot of our participants, the young ones especially, would have seen it. But I remember Dr. Hans Rosling, who's a Swedish doctor, his video went viral on YouTube and many other social media accounts where he helped visualize the global population in terms of boxes. And one of his sort of key takeaways with that entire visualization was that eventually we're going to end up in a world where the majority boxes, or the majority place where the population falls, where it's growing, the socioeconomic demographic is going to eventually move on further. So these are going to be people that are going to become, go from lower class to upper class and middle class, etc. And as that sort of transition happens from foot to bike to car, people will start having less children. So we will reach a terminus where the population will eventually peak for the globe. And then it will stabilize, or at least that was the hypothesis. I would like to get your view of how do you see, and if you can help us visualize, what does the global population look like today? And is this scenario still realistic?
Hans makes some very good points. There's a number of assumptions that we might peel back a few layers on the onion here to understand this. First of all, the 250,000 250,000 daily net gain is a relevant factor. This is going on right now. he's probably right that over the long course of history, the numbers will stabilize. But where? Where will they stabilize? In other words, we're at 7.8 billion now. We've more than doubled since the first Earth Day. The trajectory is flattening a little bit, but where, will it peak at 14 million? Some people say 11 million. That could be another doubling before it stabilizes. Think of that, another doubling. We're already, how many more plastics do we need? Can we possibly spew into the ocean? The microplastics, how much more biodiversity is going to be compromised if we double again, so he's right. Eventually it will plateau out, but a very minor adjustment in fertility today will make a big difference as to whether it doubles again before it plateaus, or maybe at 11 billion, which doesn't quite double, but is, we're already breaching the limit, or will it flatten a little bit less? I wish Hans would spend a little more time focused on what the consequence is, the urgency of dealing with the issue right now. He's right that it's going to stabilize, but I don't know that we have time. We're already beyond, we're beyond the limit now. It's not like we can say, oh, let's, we'll take care of that down the road. We got to deal with it now. We had to deal with it 50 years ago. And I thought we did.
That's true. Yeah. If you look at the devastation, if you look at the rainforest, if you look at the number of species that have been already extinguished, if we look at so many factors that we have now, we are in now, waiting for another 50 years or even 10 years or 20 years, it will be a disaster. There's nothing is going to be left of the earth the way you and I know it. It will be barren land, and the air will be impossible to breathe. And I don't know how the future generations, young people that we're focusing on now, will be able to survive in that kind of a realm.
What you're seeing there with Christine, let me just share this. What you're seeing there with Christine is a sentiment for the future. Those people in the future are never going to thank her for that. No one's going to come up to her and say, way to go, Christine. They wouldn't even know who to thank. And that's an interesting part of this. That's where we started this. How far into the future do these young activists today really look? And I think they're looking long-term, as we did in 1970. I had no idea how far down the road we were looking. I had no idea. Because it's still the future as far as I can tell. It's still out there. Nothing much has changed. It's only gotten worse, basically. But, that sentiment that you share, Christine, is a selfless sentiment that has to be respected, that has to be honored today. And just like Senator Gaylord Nelson, that was a selfless part of his life. And the only way to honor that is for us in the future and for future people to do what they can to make it better for the future. You're right. You can see it. You can look at the biodiversity casualties around the globe. Stunning. It's a fragile and resilient ecosystem, and our lives are perilously embedded in that ecosystem, that web of life that cradles our life. And we can pull out these strands on the web of life with impunity for a while, but eventually it's like popping rivets out of the airplane. You can pop rivets out of the airplane for a while, but eventually the plane is going to spiral down.
That's true. John, in 1917, Senator Gaylord issued sort of a cause for concern. 50 years on, we're issuing another cause for concern, but differently, our cause for concern has to be accompanied with a course of action. What can that course of action for the future generation now look like? What can we do today that can have the greatest impact on reducing population or stabilizing population? and then sort of what might be the other actions that can, you know, help that impact.
Apurv, that question is highly context sensitive. In general, like I've mentioned before, in general, it is the gender equity issues that would tend to bring fertility down. I mean, it is kind of a general rule that where women have equal standing, they don't have, I mean, we don't need to have astrophysicists. We just need to have respect for people across the globe, and particularly women. Fertility rates come down. So then you have to ask yourself, well, what is it that's keeping women from acquiring gender equity? And I want to emphasize, when you look at these charts and try to figure out what the differences are, you look at the total fertility rate column. I know you can't see that here, but you can see country by country total fertility rate. It's like a bit like reading the tea leaves, but you try to figure out, well, what is it that causes these countries to be higher and those countries to be lower? And then if you come up with the conclusion, like I did, that it's gender equity, then you have to ask yourself, well, what is it? What is it that's keeping women from advancing? In some cases, it is religion. In other cases, it's cultural imperatives. In other cases, it's just guys being guys. I'm sorry to say that. Again, testosterone. It's
biological predisposition.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, so then this is an anecdote, but there are places in Africa where there is a single radio tower in town. So everybody pretty much listens to that radio station. And there are groups that put out Population Media Center. They put out radio soap operas. And in these areas, there's a sense that it's not religious, it's just the social cultural imperative that women are second-class citizens. So in this radio soap opera, since they have kind of a monopoly, there's only one radio tower in town, so they kind of have a monopoly there. This money is well spent. And there, the protagonist will make some kind of a transition. Just like every movie, every show, somebody makes a transition from here and then they wind up going over here. So the protagonist, either it's the guy who figures out how to respect a woman, or the woman who realizes that she can stand up for herself with impunity. These transitions take place, and the family planning clinics in these areas can register a sizable increase in the number of people seeking their services when the protagonist makes the transition in the area that this radio tower broadcasts. So that works where you have one radio tower, where you don't have 100 different radio stations and the message is lost. So it can work there. Apurv asks a wonderful question. What might work in other places? Well, you know, again, you have to, as a Peace Corps volunteer 50 years ago, almost 50 years ago, I can say it helps to embed oneself in the community, to understand the people, to speak the language, get to know them, and figure out what is causing it right here, which isn't going to be the same as what's causing high fertility over there. This is not a silver bullet. This is something that requires context, sensitivity. And by the way, there are billions of dollars now that are flowing into that arena by wealthy foundations around the world. So it's something that we're working on. That's how we got from 2.1% increase per year down to 1.2. Of course, the problem is we have a bigger base on which it's operating now.
What do you think of the China one child per family? I mean, we always have interns from Hong Kong and from China. And personally, I feel that the best thing that the Chinese government could have done, even though it's with a communist orientation, but I really think that by promoting one child per family, not only has their influence in the world went up considerably, but also the number of people. I mean, it used to be that it had much, much more numbers than India. And now, of course, India is very quickly catching up because India doesn't have any kind of policy. So would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, it is true that this policy did a great deal to help China bring down its numbers. Already, you can, even notwithstanding that, you can see people in Shanghai and places that are so densely populated, they're wearing masks, not for the coronavirus, but just because there is so much pollution in the air. Imagine if they would not have done that, how much worse the situation would have been. And when these policies were being conceived back in the 60s and 70s, we really didn't have enough empirical evidence of how gender equity around the world can bring down human fertility. We didn't know that yet. We didn't have the evidence. And so what your question really asks is, okay, so there was this draconian policy that forced abortions is probably not something that everybody in the world can feel real good about. Was that, can we in retrospect today be critical of that when they're trying their level best? They knew they had to do something. Was this a responsible thing to do? Well, to be sure, they didn't have the evidence that gender equity can do this. Today, we don't need to go through that. All we have to do, it seems so simple, but it's so hard. I don't know why it has to be difficult. Why can't we treat each other with respect, particularly women? And when that happens, fertility rates go down. It doesn't matter. The rest of it doesn't seem to matter. And by the way, please convince yourself of that. Again, it's like reading the tea leaves, but go to these charts and try to, tell me I'm wrong. I'm eager to be proven wrong. That's how I read it. And maybe I want to read that, but so I don't know that forced abortions or draconian measures are needed today when it seems so much simpler to educate women, treat women with respect. It shouldn't be that hard, but it is.
I think that segues beautifully into this next question I have for you, John. It comes from Alex Rossello. He asks, your conclusions linking women empowerment, education, and population reduction seems in line with Nicholas Kristof. From your experience, what are some specific actions you have witnessed that have yielded best results in promoting gender equity?
Well, again, it depends on the context. That's a great question, and thank you for that question. Where I was a Peace Corps volunteer, and we're going back almost 50 years now, that was in the Philippines. I was a Peace Corps volunteer there, and where you have the religious imperative for high fertility at that time, it was a very difficult conversation to have. I was there to help increase the food production as a mechanical engineer at the time, and you just can't create enough food where you have people basically living their lives on a landfill. There's so many people, and that's where, so I wish I could point to greater success there, but again, that's almost a half century ago. Today, we're finding that the mere availability of family planning services is not enough. There has to be something more, because if there are cultural and social imperatives against it, well, you have to deal with those. If it's a religious imperative, you have to deal with it. Fortunately, the Pope a while ago said something like people shouldn't procreate like rabbits.
That's right.
Well, I mean, he's still not in favor of contraception, let alone abortion, but at least he said that. So that's a step in the direction.
And he said that in the Philippines.
Yes, thank you. Yeah. So what if it's just a macho thing that's taking place in the country, independent of, say, religious imperatives, but it's a macho kind of a thing. how do you deal with that? What if it's the Taliban that really views women in a way that we would find reprehensible? What will that's the question that's being asked. And I know I'm shrugging my shoulder because it's very difficult to go to the Taliban and say, you know, I have this idea that it might not work. You're going to have to be smart about this. And it's a very, very important issue. All I can say is it's context specific. It's a wonderful question, but go there, understand it, live with the people, see what they're saying, learn their language, and together we can maybe figure out a way to solve this.
Yeah.
But we have Apurv in India, so that's a big step forward.
Yeah. Well, and India's fertility rates are coming down. They are coming down. They're still very high, but you know, progress is being made. And there are places in India that are now at sub-replacement level fertility. It's not true across the country, but there are places. So, yeah.
John, I want to ask you, and when we have this question, we have actually a few questions about the same topic, so I'm going to loop them all into one question. Is to what extent do you feel that the Sustainable Developmental Goals have been effective in sort of putting the population agenda on government priority and through their own architecture? Have they been helpful in addressing this as a problem, especially given now that we are standing at a very critical decade, you know, almost about 5,000 days, as they're now saying, to the expiry of the SDGs in 2030. Is this a developmental agenda that can appropriately respond to this crisis?
It will need more work. It will need more. That's
saying it very nicely. I don't think that they're really doing enough because there's too much pressure from the governments. Many of the other governments do not want to take this issue because that will mean changing their usual social pattern. And that is a big, big problem.
And you'll get pushback from people that believe that the economy must grow, and it must grow with more people. So if there's that sentiment, that's the only way to solve it. I mean, you have to have more people. You got to grow the economy, so you need more people, rather than thinking of what is the per capita lifestyle. What is the quality of life on a per capita basis? That would make maybe a little more sense toward our overall goals here. But if you're just looking at the economy in a macro level and say it's got to grow, well, you got to have more people.
Yeah, and it comes back to the first question around sort of, you know, our entire system being designed that requires more people to function. I mean, even if you look at per capita material use, it's gone up exponentially. You know, it's gone up by 70% per person in the last 20 years and 133% since 1990. So this is a very sort of systemic issue, but important to get your thoughts on the developmental agenda that the entire world is looking towards and trying to sort of achieve is not fully designed to address such a big concern around population.
Yeah.
John, I'm conscious. Oh,
go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead. I was just saying I'm conscious of time. We have about 7 minutes. So I think what would be very beneficial for all our attendees over here is we've been discussing various aspects of the pandemic through these With Virtual Voices series. With Bernie, we discussed the pandemic and climate change. Ambassador Sergeyev discussed politics. To what extent, sort of, and I know you touched upon this previously, but what kind of sort of ending parting words would you like to sort of give the participants and the viewers around exponential population growth in an era where these kind of pandemics would be even more likely?
Professor Bartlett from the University of Colorado years ago said, the greatest shortcoming of the human mind is the inability to understand the exponential function. So from one day to the next, and this really is all a function of exponential forces. We talked about that earlier here, this thing here. From one day to the next, you don't notice a difference. Everything is pretty much the same. The changes are incremental, but more importantly, imperceptible. You don't notice it. When you go back to your, say, hometown where you grew up 20 years later, 30 years later, and you see that the parkland that you used to play in is no longer there. The stream where you used to go fishing no longer has fish. There's waste, there's plastic debris everywhere. And then you ask yourself, well, how did this just happen? The fact is, it didn't just happen. It happened one day to the next, incrementally, and then this curve goes like this. And then eventually, when it gets up here, it's too late because it has such momentum that it's very difficult to flatten that curve again. And that's really where we are. We're still trying to flatten that curve. It's almost like a car that has momentum that you're trying to apply the brakes, and you want to get the brakes on in time, but the more inertia that you have, the faster it's going, the longer it's going to take to apply the brakes. And that's where we are. So understanding that force, that even though it might plateau down, it will plateau, but understanding that force right now is very important. And even just to put it into our vocabulary, that we have about 250,000 daily net gain. People don't talk about that. If we could just talk about that, then the ethics that go with this, the ethics of how do we manage, how do we responsibly think of the future, at least we could have a meaningful conversation. People don't even know that. They don't talk about it. So that's maybe one of the most important things that happens today. And I thank you for this opportunity.
Well, ignorance is bliss, as the saying goes. And I think that what you just said about exponential inability, or should I say the exponential threat and the inability of most people to understand it, is a very, very important concept. And I think that maybe what we need to do is devise an agenda that will focus on how to get people to actually take this into consideration. Well, we're trying to do it here on a small scale, but basically there has to be a way to be able to broadcast it on a larger scale so that more people are aware of that. And hopefully, well, we're going to put this on YouTube, and hopefully more people are going to be aware of it. And we're certainly going to be talking about it. We have been talking about it for many, many years. But, you know, it's one little voice, and we need to have that voice have a very, very big megaphone. Thank you very much. You've been just excellent. Thank you.
Thank you, Christine and Apurv.
Thank you, John. And you know, as Dr. Durbach just said, it's this kind of discussion meets with a lot of inertia, especially within the UN system, among governments, because there's just something about it that is always not politically correct, and that's something that World Information Transfer has been actively fighting, along with the issues it chooses. So thank you again, John, for joining us with this discussion. Thank you to everyone who participated in this webinar series. Next up, we have Mr. Igor Shpinov from the United Nations joining us. He's going to be talking about UN's response to the pandemic through its conference agenda. And everyone will receive invitations about that webinar. So I look forward to seeing you all then. John, thank you once again for taking out the time.